we'll just dive straight in then. So Anna asked me to talk to you guys today about the process of curating and putting together an exhibition for your project, how the Ohio Civil Rights Movement tied into the National Civil Rights Movement. And so when you're starting to think about an exhibition, the first thing you have to think about is, what are you interpreting? So for you all, this may be, how the history of Ohio is connected to the larger history of the Civil Rights Movement. A simple statement like that, you just need something to set parameters to tell you, what are we trying to interpret here? What are we doing? So once you've decided what you're doing, you want to define your scope. So for you all, this is something that you all will need to agree on, taking that statement that I just said and putting more barriers on it. So like dates and maybe, the larger civil rights movement in the Midwest or east of the Mississippi River or in the South, something like that. So you just need to set some barriers for yourself. And then you're going to develop your thesis. And your thesis is essentially your argument, where you're saying, this is what we think the civil rights movement in Ohio means and is connected, and how it is connected to the national movement. So you can think of your scope as, say, like a wall or a fence, something that you build around your thesis, and it helps keep you on point. Whether it's a topic or an object, if it doesn't fit your scope, then it doesn't fit in the exhibit. And it keeps you on track and keeps you from straying. So once you've defined what you're interpreting, your scope, your thesis, then you can move on to starting to look for objects. And the purpose of an object, in your case, photographs, is to serve as a piece of evidence to support the argument in your thesis. Just like you might have an argument with somebody at home, you're trying to prove your point and you're saying, this is why I am right. So these photographs and the research you're going to do are your evidence for why you think the civil rights movement connects to civil rights movement in Ohio connects to the larger national movement. So for something to serve as a piece of evidence, though, it has to be real. It has to be authentic. So you all are not going to be physically collecting these photographs, so you won't have to look at it and, figure out if it's from the right time period. But what you will need to do is use your resources, your online resources, whichever database you're using, and you'll need to verify the dates, the locations, the subjects, the people that are in the photographs, the events that's happening. And you're going to have to also look at it and make sure that you trace it back to the original source and make sure that you're using an image that has not been altered or manipulated from the original photograph. And this is important because you can easily crop an image, and this can quickly change the meaning of it, especially if you interpret it through your own words. If you cut out half of an image, half of the action that's happening, the viewer can quickly fill in what they think is happening. But when you're using it as evidence, it's important that you use it in its original state. So for example, if you all are looking at two photographs, you all are going to want to find images, information that is specific as possible. The more specific information you have, the stronger the evidence is. So for example, if you had two photographs and you had to choose between them, and say your first photograph is the information you have is just a civil rights march somewhere in Ohio in the late 1960s. That's not bad, but you can't really tie a lot of threads from that. You can't make a lot of connections. Say your second photograph is something like, the information you have is a civil rights march organized by African-American business leaders in Dayton, Ohio on July 17th, 1969. Now, that's not an actual event that happened. I'm just making that up. But if you had that type of information, then you can start asking questions like, well, why were they marching? Why did they do it that day? What else was going on? Were people elsewhere in Ohio marching on that same day? Who was there? What else were they supporting? You can start asking these questions, and that's how you start drawing connections to the national story. So the more specific information you have for all of your objects or photographs, for this instance, the stronger your evidence will be and the more connections you can draw. So since I work for a museum that does the American Revolution, I don't have any photographs to share with you. but I'm going to just show you a few objects that kind of fit these different levels of specificity and how we use them. So this first one, I'll hold it up and you can kind of see it. This is a compass from the American Revolution, or from the era of the American Revolution. We do not have any documentation of who used it. We don't know specifically when it was made, who made it. We don't know where it was used. But what we do know is that it is a compass from the 1700s. So in this case, this object helps us by, this is a representative example of a compass of the type that could have been used in the American Revolution. But other than that, we can't tie it to a person, an event, a place, an occurrence, anything like that. So another object we have is this. I'll have to hold it up a little bit. This is a camp stove, and we know through our documentation that this was used during the American Revolution. And what's important about that is that that at least gives us a smaller time period. We know that this was used sometime between 1775 and 1783. So we can start drawing connections to, you know, the war itself, the time period. We know that it was made in the United States, but again, we don't know specifically who used it. We don't know any specific places it was used. So we can't tie it to, say, a specific battle or occurrence or person, but we have a smaller time period. So that helps us draw a few more connections. And so the ideal type of object is one like this. So this is a pocket watch, and this was actually made in 1747, and it was carried by Thomas Massey throughout the war. And he was from Virginia, and we have all of his records. We know all the battles he was at. We know which units he fought with. We know the people he knew. We actually have some letters that he wrote. So with that very specific information on Thomas Massey, we can then use that watch to talk about very specific things. And then we can start drawing connections to, you know, why was he at the Battle of Princeton and not on Long Island, for example. But the more specific information you can get with your photographs too, that will help you draw more connections. And after Anne asked me to do this, I was actually looking at some of the publications I get, and I wanted to show you one photograph. This is on the cover of Ohio Valley History right now. So this is a picture of a woman who was arrested on Ohio State's campus in April 1968. This is her mugshot. We know her name. We know the day she was arrested. We know why she was arrested. We know what happened to her. And we know some of what she was thinking. So this is a really good object. So in April 1968, that's the same month that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. There was a lot of civil unrest at that time, and her and 33 other people were arrested on Ohio State's campus for protesting. And they were protesting unfair conditions on campus, and they were also protesting his assassination. So there's a lot of connections there. So that's a very specific example of the civil rights movement in Ohio. But also, this is a very compelling photograph. If I hadn't shared all of that detail with you, you could look at that photograph and start asking questions like, who is she? Why was she arrested? What was she doing when she was arrested? Why did she put herself in a position where she could be arrested? Is there anything about her that led to her being arrested? Is it because she is African American? Is it because she is a woman? Did those play a factor in her arrest? So finding very specific examples in your photographs, and then also finding photographs like that where just looking at it, your audience is going to start asking questions, and it gets them invested in what you're talking about, and then you can start drawing those connections. So once you've selected your photographs, you have done all of your writing, you've laid out your argument, you know what you want to say, then you have to start developing your exhibition. So as the curators, it's your job to make sure that everything is clear and concise. So what that really means is get to the point. Don't waste your viewers' time. Don't waste the audience time. Don't have frills and things like that. Get to the point of your argument. And I like to think of this as, so what? What's the so what of your exhibit? Why should someone listen to you? Why should they listen to what you're trying to argue? Why is what you're saying is important? Now, what you're saying is important, but it's your job to make sure that that comes across. Make sure your evidence is lined up. Now, if you've done your work and you have found those good photographs and you have all that good information and you've spent a lot of time on your writing, and make sure your writing is clear. You've clearly stated your thesis, you've clearly stated your argument. These parts of your exhibit will fall together. You don't want to get to the design phase and try to doctor it up to make it more interesting. But what you do want to do is, if you have your photographs and you have your documentation, and when you get into actually designing the exhibit, think of, or try to remember, a common theme for exhibit design is less is more. We live in a world of continually diminishing attention spans. So you need to grab your audience and you need to get your points across to them very quickly, and you need to keep their attention. So ways you can do this is making sure that you have used colors that are calming but also engaging. You know, you want to avoid harsh reds or black, things like that that really incite emotion. Think about your classrooms, the colors in your classrooms. They're calming, they're not overly exciting, but they're still soothing, and it creates a learning environment. You want to make sure that the photographs that are in your exhibit are big enough for your audience to see. You want to make sure that you pick a font that is easy to read. So a lot of called sans serif fonts. So you don't want to use like Comic Sans. That's an obvious one. But fonts that have a lot of frills coming off of them, that if somebody has bad eyesight, it might be harder for them to read. Make sure the font is a big enough size. Make sure the font is a color that's easy to read. And you want to make sure throughout your exhibit that you're keeping your fonts and your sizes and your colors consistent. If someone's, a lot of times in a museum exhibit, if people haven't checked all the detail and there's different styles of font, there's different sizes, colors, that's really distracting. Your job as the curators is to take away all of that distraction and make sure that somebody can focus all of their attention on your content and looking at the photos you've selected. And so once you have a draft of your exhibit ready, don't be afraid to test it on your friends or your family, your classmates. Pick people to test it on who you know will tell you the truth and give you critical feedback. If they see a problem, they're going to tell you. Don't be afraid of criticism. You know, they're trying to help you make the exhibit better. And then if you also want to look for other ideas, don't be afraid to go to like the Smithsonian's website. They have a lot of online exhibitions, or the Field Museum in Chicago, or any other big museum. You know, pick a topic that you are interested in and go. And if there's something about that exhibit that you find engaging, don't be afraid to borrow it. Museum professionals look at each other's exhibits, and we all borrow from each other too. So if there's something you see that you like, that you think works, use that in your exhibit. So that's a really quick run through of the curating and exhibit design in a museum. So do you guys have any questions? I know I just threw a lot at you.
Okay, can you explain a little bit about what an exhibition is and kind of what goes into it?
So think of an exhibition as it's really a multi-dimensional research paper. So, you know, you've written research papers before where you have to write out your thoughts and you have reasons for this, and this is why you think that. When you're doing an exhibition, you're using physical objects as your evidence, not citations or ideas. And so what you are doing, whether it's on a computer or if it's at a museum, you're taking somebody physically through space where they're going to encounter text, images, objects, and you're taking them through your argument in a physical way.
You don't have to have access to some magazines and stuff like you have the Ohio Historical Valley. What was that magazine that you showed? how maybe we can get to some of those resources?
Yeah, you should be able to. So, Library of Congress has a lot of photographs online for free. Ohio History Connection would be a good place to go. A lot of universities have image libraries. Um, and, just Googling around isn't a bad way to also try to find some stuff, just typing in keywords. The thing is, you don't want to just pull an image off of Wikipedia or a website or somebody's blog. What you want to do is if you find an image, say like on Wikipedia or a blog or, even, another website, click on that image and you want to try to trace it back to its original source. So the image on the cover of this magazine is from the Ohio State University archives. So if you saw this magazine, open the cover, look for the citation. They're going to say where they got the image from, and you want to trace it back.
I have another question about where you get your artifacts from. Like, where did you get the camp stove?
Yeah, so that actually came from a private collection. We have people who, so for the SAR, we have a scope and a thesis that we're always working with when we're developing the collection. And we specifically asked for a camp stove because we want to talk about the everyday life of soldiers and how they survive. So we share ideas like that, and we get together as a team and think about the types of objects we want. So we have some people who are out there working for us who look for those types of objects, and then once they find it, it can either be donated, sometimes we purchase it, sometimes people lend it, but there's a lot of different ways to get objects in a museum.
What was one of your favorite finds or whatever?
Well, we actually just got a cannon in last week. It's a deck gun off of a ship, and those are really hard to find. A lot of them were actually melted down for scrap metal during World War II. So a lot of cannons from the American Revolution and the Civil War don't exist anymore because they were turned into tank parts during World War II. So to find this particular cannon that we got was, it was pretty special because not a lot of them are out there.
You mentioned earlier in the day, at least, about the photograph from Ohio State, and you mentioned that you looked at the and you put together the part that it was right after the Martin Luther King assassination. What about, like, these are ninth graders and they don't necessarily have the scope of history that you have? Like, how do you find out about history, or like you don't already know?
Yeah, so you want to check. You can start with your textbooks. That's a good place to start, and just go into history books and looking at timelines. There's a lot of really good online resources where there's a timeline where it'll tell you the series of events that happened in the civil rights movement, and it can be difficult to keep everything in line. History is taught as names and dates, but that's not actually how it happened. It's a series of events. Individual people made decisions that impacted others, and other people decided they either liked or did not like that. And history is a very complex web and network of events that have happened. So for instance, if you had seen the photograph of this woman at Ohio State and I saw that it happened in April 1968, I mean, you could even just start with Googling what happened in April 1968. The internet is not a bad place to start your research, but then once you see that, that it happened immediately after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., then you want to go pull up an encyclopedia or get your textbook or get a history book and look up, why was that significant? What are historians saying on that?
So if your photograph doesn't have an exact date, how can you go off of that? How would you recommend that they go about finding some of the more specific details that maybe their photo doesn't provide?
Well, there's one method would be to actually look at the photograph, and you can sometimes from the subjects in it discern a time range. Another option would be, and which I would recommend, is that, you know, using that as a criteria for selecting photographs, that when you're looking, you know, find one that is interesting to you and compelling, but finding a photograph that has all of that documentation, you know, going to the Ohio State University archives or the Library of Congress and making sure that they have all of that documentation there.
I would say also reading the text that surrounds it. It might not be the caption, but it might be wherever it came from. Context from where it came from.
Right.
All right, wave and say thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Good luck, guys. Have fun on your exhibit.